Jason the Ghost, Whitmore, and Malik, Steele Harris Warren, Just Gangsters. They were architects of the hidden empire that controlled Britain's streets while the police slept, and their rise would change the underworld forever. In the late 1980s, the streets of Britain's cities were changing in ways most people didn't notice. Council estates, once buzzing with life and community, had begun to crumble under neglect and poverty. Factories and warehouses that had provided generations with steady work were shutting down, leaving entire neighborhoods without purpose. For the young men and women growing up in these forgotten corners, survival became a daily challenge. The rules of the outside world seemed irrelevant. A new set of rules had emerged, unspoken but powerful. Small groups of teenagers started forming crews, initially to steal what they needed or to take part in illegal betting. These acts were small, almost invisible to the authorities, but they marked the beginning of something far larger. Over time, these crews learned the language of fear and respect, discovering how intimidation could protect them more effectively than any weapon. The earliest leaders were rarely the most violent. They were clever, observant, and patient. They watched how people reacted to threats and rewards, understanding which gestures earned loyalty and which sparked rebellion. They learned to manipulate, to command without raising suspicion, and to move through the shadows of society unnoticed. Many of these future gangsters had grown up in broken homes, where lessons in trust and betrayal had been taught early. They carried these lessons into the streets, shaping the first foundations of organized crime in Britain. Every small success brought attention, but it also brought danger. Rival crews would attempt to claim the same territory, and the balance of power was fragile. A single misstep could destroy months of careful planning. By the end of the decade, what had started as scattered street crews began to resemble organized networks. Small-scale theft evolved into more ambitious schemes. Nightclubs, bars, and local warehouses became staging grounds for criminal enterprise. Drugs began to appear, first as a trickle, then as a flood that could be channeled through the city's transport routes. The leaders understood that fear was a tool, but money was the ultimate power. Control over finances meant control over people, and those who held it quietly built their empires, while others fought over scraps. The streets taught harsh lessons in loyalty and betrayal. Friends who had grown up together were sometimes forced to make impossible choices. Those who tried to rise too quickly, without understanding the unspoken rules, often disappeared from the neighborhood altogether, either imprisoned or worse. Meanwhile, the more cautious leaders solidified their power, learning that patience could be more valuable than brute strength. They observed the police, the media, and even local politicians, calculating their moves with precision. By the time the 1990s approached, Britain's underworld had changed. What had begun as desperate survival on neglected estates had transformed into the foundation for the rise of the country's most feared gangsters. The seeds of power, planted in shadowed corners of the city, had begun to sprout. The streets were no longer just dangerous, they were lessons, proving that the next generation of Underworld Kings was learning not just to survive, but to dominate. Their empire would grow quietly, invisibly, and relentlessly, shaping a new chapter in Britain's criminal history that few would see coming. This first chapter of Britain's underworld was written not with headlines or public notoriety, but in whispered warnings, coded signals, and silent agreements. Every alley, every abandoned building, every late-night deal added another layer to a system that would one day become unstoppable. The rise of these gangsters had begun, and no one outside their world fully understood the power they were about to wield. As the 1990s began, the small crews that had once roamed council estates began to realize that survival was no longer enough. Power required expansion. The streets were crowded with rival gangs, and petty theft could only sustain a few. Leaders who had learned patience and cunning in the 1980s now sought to grow their influence beyond familiar neighborhoods. Nightclubs, warehouses, and transport routes became the new frontiers. These locations were not just places to make money, they were symbols of control. Owning or dominating a venue meant sending a message. This territory belonged to them, and anyone who challenged that would face consequences. The leaders understood that visibility was dangerous, so they operated through intermediaries. They never touched the goods themselves. Others carried out the risky work while they orchestrated everything from the shadows. Drug distribution became the most lucrative venture. What started as a trickle of small deals soon turned into organized networks moving cocaine, heroin, and ecstasy through ports, train stations, and highways. Smuggling was no longer haphazard. Leaders devised careful routes, hidden compartments, and coded communications. The flow of illegal substances created wealth that dwarfed anything the gangs had seen before. With money came influence. People who had once ignored the crews now sought their approval, whether out of fear or the promise of profit. By controlling who had access to clubs, pubs, and transportation hubs, the gang leaders were shaping the city according to their rules. Violence was still a tool, but it was measured and deliberate. Random attacks were avoided because they drew police attention. Instead, intimidation became subtle, psychological, and terrifyingly effective. A warning delivered through a known associate, a damaged vehicle left on a driveway, or a carefully orchestrated accident could enforce obedience without a single shot being fired. Those who tried to expand too quickly without respect for the hierarchy often disappeared or were humiliated publicly, ensuring the lesson was remembered. The most dangerous and effective leaders were invisible. They stayed in the background, rarely seen on the streets, yet every move they made was felt. Lower-ranking members competed for territory, unaware that every victory was being orchestrated to benefit someone far above them. Loyalty was carefully cultivated and rewarded, but betrayal was punished swiftly. These leaders understood human nature better than most politicians or business executives. They could manipulate alliances, create conflicts, and remove obstacles without exposing themselves. As the decade progressed, the gangs evolved into sophisticated organizations. They began to invest in legitimate businesses, laundering money through car dealerships, property, and import companies. This not only protected their wealth, but also provided a veneer of respectability. Police efforts struggled to keep up. Arrests of minor players did little to disrupt the networks, because the real power was always one step removed. The leaders were invisible kings, controlling vast territories, yet appearing to the public as ordinary citizens. By the mid-1990s, Britain's underworld had transformed. The small crews of the 1980s had become structured organizations with hierarchies, rules, and strategies. What had once been survival-driven opportunism was now calculated ambition. The streets were no longer just dangerous. They were chessboards where the cleverest players dictated every move. This expansion marked the first true taste of power for the gangsters who had come to dominate Britain's criminal landscape. They had learned that patience, planning, and invisibility were more valuable than brute force, and their influence was only beginning to spread, promising an era of control that would shock the country in the years to come. As the 1990s progressed, the true nature of Britain's underworld began to emerge, and it became clear that power was not just about money or territory. It was about loyalty, trust, and betrayal. Many gangs were built on family ties and long-standing friendships, bonds forged in childhood or shared hardship. These relationships were their greatest strength, providing a network of loyalty that outsiders could not easily penetrate. For years, these connections allowed gangs to operate with a sense of invincibility. The people on the streets believed that blood and friendship would protect these crews from danger. However, the same ties that created unity could also breed jealousy, resentment, and greed. As the stakes grew higher, the pressure tested these bonds in ways no one had anticipated. Success brought attention, and attention brought temptation. Some gang members, frustrated by being overshadowed or impatient for their share of the profits, began to act in secret. Deals were made behind closed doors with rivals, financial records were manipulated, and allegiances shifted silently. One by one, the invisible rules that had governed loyalty were broken. A friend who had shared a childhood home could suddenly become a liability if they threatened the interests of a more powerful member. The streets that once offered protection now concealed hidden threats, and the line between ally and enemy blurred. Violence continued to play a role, but it became more precise and shocking. Public attacks were rare, reserved for moments when a message needed to be sent clearly and irrevocably. Instead, many eliminations occurred quietly. Disappearances, staged accidents, and sudden arrests removed key figures from the landscape without warning. Often, the hand that orchestrated these moves was a familiar one, someone within the very network the victim had trusted. The sense of betrayal ran deep, leaving lasting scars on the community and the crews themselves. Those who survived these internal purges emerged stronger, but also more cautious, having learned that survival required constant vigilance. The betrayals also forced leaders to adapt. They could no longer rely solely on loyalty and fear. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, and strategic alliances became essential. Every interaction was measured, every conversation potentially a test of trust. The smartest leaders maintained multiple layers of protection, keeping their most valuable members close while ensuring no single person held the key to their empire. Financial networks were compartmentalized, operations segmented, and messages coded. The underworld was becoming a sophisticated machine, with betrayal as both a weapon and a warning. Yet, despite the internal turmoil, the gangs continued to expand. Control over territory, drugs, and illicit businesses grew more organized. Leaders understood that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be earned constantly and monitored. The psychological games played within the gangs were as crucial as any street-level confrontation. Those who could manipulate friendships, rivalries, and ambitions wielded more power than those who relied purely on force. By the end of the decade, it was clear that the underworld was no longer merely about surviving the streets. It was about mastering the human element. The rise of Britain's gangsters depended as much on understanding betrayal as it did on violence or money. Trust could build empires, but it could also destroy them. Those who learned to navigate the treacherous waters of loyalty and deceit became the true kings of the streets, setting the stage for the invisible power structures that would define the next era of Britain's criminal underworld. Every lesson in betrayal hardened them. Every calculated strike reinforced their dominance. And every surviving leader emerged smarter, colder, and more untouchable than before. By the early 2000s, a new breed of gangster had begun to emerge in Britain's underworld, one who ruled without ever setting foot on the streets. These leaders had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They understood that visibility meant vulnerability, and violence alone could never secure lasting power. Instead, they focused on control, strategy, and secrecy. While lower-level members carried out robberies, drug deals, and intimidation, these invisible bosses orchestrated entire networks from afar. Their influence stretched across cities, ports, and even international borders. Yet few people outside the underworld ever knew their names. These invisible leaders operated like corporate executives rather than traditional criminals. They invested in legitimate businesses, including property development, import-export companies, and luxury car dealerships, using them to launder money while providing an additional layer of protection. No police report ever named them, no camera ever captured them in action, yet the structures of crime were entirely under their command. They communicated through intermediaries, using coded language and complex hierarchies to ensure that their orders reached the right people without revealing their identities. Even within their own organizations, only a few trusted lieutenants knew their true positions, creating layers of separation that made infiltration nearly impossible. While violence was still part of the equation, it was carefully managed. Street-level skirmishes and territorial disputes were allowed to play out, giving the appearance of chaos while the real power remained untouched. The invisible bosses used these conflicts to manipulate outcomes, remove rivals, and test loyalty, all without dirtying their own hands. They had learned that the public spectacle of violence was both a tool and a liability. It inspired fear, yes, but it also attracted attention from law enforcement and media, which could threaten the empire. Therefore, the most effective leaders avoided unnecessary exposure and relied on calculation and patience to maintain dominance. The transition to invisibility also changed the psychology of the underworld. Fear alone no longer guaranteed obedience. Members were expected to follow complex systems of hierarchy, pay dues, and report results. Disobedience was met with swift, often unseen consequences. Those who thought they could challenge the authority of an invisible boss quickly realized they were fighting a shadow they could never fully grasp. Even seasoned criminals, accustomed to street power and physical intimidation, found themselves outmaneuvered by strategic planning and foresight. By now, the underworld had evolved into a highly sophisticated network, blending old-school intimidation with modern organizational methods. These invisible kings had turned chaos into structure, using intelligence, strategy, and foresight to control vast territories without ever stepping into the line of fire. They had effectively rewritten the rules of Britain's criminal world. The era of gangsters fighting for street corners and nightclubs was giving way to a quieter, more calculated form of dominance, one that operated in the background, unnoticed by the public, but omnipresent in its effect. The rise of these unseen leaders marked a turning point. Britain's underworld was no longer dominated by brash, visible figures who flaunted their power. Instead, a new generation of gangsters had learned to survive by disappearing, to dominate by observing, and to rule by manipulating events from the shadows. The streets remained dangerous, but the real kings were no longer among the chaos. They were the architects behind it, untouchable, invisible, and more powerful than ever before. Their reign had just begun, and it would shape the underworld for years to come. Even the most careful plans could not prevent violence from resurfacing. By the mid-2000s, Britain's underworld had reached unprecedented levels of organization, yet the delicate balance maintained by invisible bosses was fragile. Street-level disputes, personal grudges, and sudden power grabs threatened to expose entire networks. While the leaders operated from the shadows, the people carrying out their orders were human-prone to mistakes, betrayal, and emotion. A single careless act could unravel years of careful planning, and the consequences were often catastrophic. Public attacks became rarer, but far more shocking when they occurred. A nightclub shooting or a warehouse raid could send ripples through entire criminal networks. Law enforcement, long frustrated by the elusive nature of the invisible bosses, began to adjust their approach. Special crime units focused on financial trails, surveillance, and intelligence gathering, rather than just arrests for violent crimes. The streets may have appeared calm to outsiders, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Every violent act, every disappearance, and every sudden arrest became part of a larger puzzle, threatening to expose the hidden architects of the underworld. The human element remained the most unpredictable factor. Trusted lieutenants and enforcers were often the source of vulnerability. Ambition, fear, or a personal grudge could lead a loyal member to act recklessly, revealing connections that had been carefully hidden for years. One such incident, a poorly planned hit that went public, caused a chain reaction across multiple networks. Police traced the violence back to lower-level operatives, who, under questioning, revealed more than anyone expected. Territories that had been stable for years erupted into chaos. Alliances dissolved, and the illusion of control faltered. Even the invisible leaders were forced to act, quietly relocating assets, moving personnel, and reasserting authority through intimidation or subtle maneuvers. The media, too, played a role in amplifying the perception of chaos. High-profile incidents were sensationalized, giving the public the impression that gangs were carelessly violent and disorganized. In reality, these moments were exceptions, often exploited by the leaders themselves to distract attention from larger operations. The underworld had learned that perception was as important as reality. By letting violence speak at the surface while maintaining control behind the scenes, the bosses reinforced fear, loyalty, and obedience among their members. The era also saw law enforcement developing specialized strategies. Undercover operations, wiretaps, and financial investigations became critical tools. Arrests were no longer random. They targeted weak links and overlooked associates whose exposure could lead to larger networks. The invisible bosses, aware of these evolving threats, became even more meticulous. Communication was restricted to trusted channels. Meetings were carefully staged, and every financial transaction was masked through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Despite these pressures, the gangs adapted. Violence, while dangerous and often unpredictable, became a controlled variable rather than a default method of enforcement. It was used strategically, with every attack sending a calculated message. By the end of this period, Britain's criminal networks had survived public scrutiny, police pressure, and internal instability. Yet the events of these years left a permanent mark. The underworld realized that even invisibility and careful planning could not fully eliminate risk. The streets had spoken, and the lessons were clear: power was fragile, loyalty was conditional, and the smallest mistake could ignite a storm that even the most cowiest king could not control. The game had become deadlier, and the stakes had never been higher. By the late 2000s, the British underworld faced a turning point that no one had fully anticipated. Years of careful planning, invisible leadership, and controlled violence had created powerful networks. But even the most sophisticated empires were not immune to disruption. A massive, coordinated investigation launched by law enforcement would shake the foundations of these criminal enterprises, exposing weaknesses that had long been hidden. This operation was unlike any the country had seen before. It combined financial intelligence, undercover surveillance, and international cooperation, targeting not just street-level operatives, but the unseen figures who had remained untouchable for decades. The impact was immediate and shocking. Bank accounts were frozen, luxury properties were seized, and shell companies were dismantled. Operations that had seemed permanent vanished overnight, leaving loyal associates without direction or protection. Arrests were not limited to minor players. Key lieutenants and mid-level managers were swept up, and some of the network as most trusted advisors were forced to turn on one another under pressure. The underworld, which had long operated in the shadows, suddenly found itself under a relentless spotlight. Streets once ruled by fear became eerily quiet as rival crews paused, unsure of who still held power and who had been removed. The sudden downfall of many figures led to chaos within the criminal hierarchy. Some gangsters fled the country, believing that distance would guarantee their survival. They sought refuge in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East, trying to rebuild their influence from afar. Others were quietly eliminated by rivals who saw opportunity in the upheaval. The familiar order that had governed Britain's underworld for years dissolved, leaving power vacuums that created instability and fear. Members who had once been untouchable now faced the reality that loyalty and invisibility were insufficient protections against modern policing and intelligence methods. Despite the disruption, the investigation also revealed a critical truth: the underworld was resilient. While many operations collapsed, others adapted. Lower-level operatives who had survived the sweep began reassembling networks, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors. The invisible bosses, even if displaced, had taught the next generation the importance of discretion, planning, and strategic thinking. The criminal landscape had been reshaped, but the foundations laid by decades of careful orchestration could never be entirely erased. The streets were quieter, But the machinery of organized crime had not disappeared. It had merely been forced to evolve. For law enforcement and the public, the scale of the crackdown seemed like the end of an era. Newspapers proclaimed the collapse of Britain's most notorious criminal networks, and communities once terrorized by street-level violence experienced a rare period of calm. Yet behind closed doors, the survivors recalculated. Lessons were learned about trust, loyalty, and the vulnerabilities of even the most sophisticated systems. The fall of so many figures served as a warning to future leaders. Power could be taken as easily as it was gained, and even the most invisible king could be exposed if he underestimated the evolving forces against him. By the end of this period, it became clear that the underworld was not finished, it was transforming. The massive investigation had removed the old guard and disrupted long-standing hierarchies, but it had also created a new environment in which adaptability and intelligence were more important than brute force. The streets were quieter, the power structures fragmented, and the rules of the game had changed forever. For Britain's gangsters, survival now depended on learning faster, moving smarter, and understanding that the fall of one empire was merely the beginning of another cycle of power, secrecy, and reinvention. Years after the massive crackdown that had dismantled much of Britain's underworld, a surprising and unexpected resurgence began to take shape. The streets had seemed quieter, the old power structures fractured, yet a new generation of gangsters was emerging, not from the council estates or the nightclubs, but from places no one would have anticipated. These were not the impulsive, violent young men of the past. They were educated, technologically savvy, and globally connected, combining the lessons of the old underworld with the tools of the modern era. While their predecessors had relied on fear, loyalty, and physical presence, this new wave understood the power of information, anonymity, and digital influence. The new gangsters operated in a way that was almost invisible to traditional policing methods. Social media, encrypted messaging apps, and cryptocurrency provided channels to move money, communicate orders, and maintain networks without leaving a trace. They were capable of running complex operations from thousands of miles away, monitoring both rivals and law enforcement in real time. Physical territory mattered less than it had in the past. Power was measured in networks, wealth, and control over information. The streets appeared calm, yet money flowed faster and more efficiently than ever. This was a silent, almost invisible form of dominance, but it was no less dangerous or effective than the violence of previous decades. In many ways, this evolution represented a continuation of the principles that had guided Britain's underworld for decades. Patience, discretion, and planning remained central to success. However, the tools and scale had changed. The new leaders invested heavily in legitimate businesses as fronts, just as their predecessors had, but they also used data and technology to predict market trends, track law enforcement patterns, and anticipate the moves of rival groups. Risk was minimized not only through secrecy, but through analysis and strategy. Every financial move, every alliance, and every action was calculated to maximize gain while minimizing exposure. The re-emergence of these gangsters also brought a subtle but profound shift in culture. Violence became a last resort rather than a defining feature. Fear was no longer the primary instrument of control. Influence and subtle manipulation replaced intimidation. Members were recruited for their skills in technology, finance, or international connections, rather than purely for loyalty or toughness. The hierarchy of power became more fluid, with authority determined by capability and knowledge rather than by past deeds or street reputation. Even long-standing gangs struggled to adapt, often being outmaneuvered by these new operators, who moved faster, planned deeper, and remained largely unseen. The rise of this new generation demonstrated that the underworld had never truly disappeared. The lessons of the past loyalty, secrecy, patience, and adaptability remained as relevant as ever, but the methods had evolved. The collapse of the old guard was not the end of Britain's criminal empire. It was a reset, a moment of transformation that allowed a more sophisticated, more resilient underworld to emerge. The streets may have seemed safer, but behind the calm, a silent modern empire was building, hinting at a future where the next generation of gangsters would be smarter, faster, and far more untouchable than anyone had imagined. This unexpected return proved a simple truth. Britain's underworld was never defined by individual empires or visible kings. It was defined by its ability to adapt, survive, and evolve. Each fall, each crackdown, each exposed network became a lesson for the next wave of leaders. The streets were quiet, the threats invisible, and the power unrecognized by the public, but the game was far from over. The underworld had returned smarter, more strategic, and ready to dominate in ways the world had yet to fully understand. Today, Britain's most powerful gangsters operate in ways the public rarely sees. They no longer seek notoriety, and the streets no longer echo with the sounds of brazen crime as they once did. Their influence is subtle, pervasive, and almost entirely invisible. The invisible kings of the underworld have perfected the art of control without exposure. Their power lies not in weapons or brute force, but in networks, influence, and secrecy. Every move is calculated, every associate monitored, and every operation structured to minimize risk while maximizing profit. They have learned from the rises and falls of their predecessors. The mistakes of visibility, impulsive violence, and overconfidence are never repeated. These gangsters operate across multiple layers of society. Legitimate businesses provide cover for illicit activities, while offshore accounts, shell companies, and digital currency protect their wealth from detection. Law enforcement can only see fragments of their operations, often mistaking low-level operatives for the true leaders. The real power remains hidden, a web of influence stretching across cities, ports, and international borders. By remaining unseen, these leaders maintain an advantage their predecessors could only dream of: omnipresence without exposure, authority without confrontation. Violence still exists, but it is rarely public. It is calculated, targeted, and carefully controlled to maintain order within their networks rather than to intimidate outsiders. The lessons of the past, the betrayals, arrests, and power struggles have instilled a sense of caution and patience in every move. Those who underestimate the sophistication of modern gangsters find themselves removed quietly, without spectacle. Even former allies are watched, tested, and sometimes eliminated if they threaten the stability of the network. Fear remains a tool, but it is subtle, psychological, and embedded within the structures of obedience rather than displayed openly on the streets. The evolution of the underworld has also changed the type of people who rise to power. Modern gangsters are often educated, tech-savvy, and strategic, blending criminal ambition with business acumen. They can manipulate financial systems, exploit legal loopholes, and control networks remotely. The era of the street fighter, relying purely on force and intimidation, has given way to the strategist, the planner, and the unseen operator. Power is no longer measured in territory alone. It is measured in influence, invisibility, and control over information. Despite the public perception of safety, the underworld is far from dormant. Networks continue to expand, adapt, and evolve. Every fallen king has taught the next generation how to survive, avoid exposure, and dominate without detection. The streets may appear calm, but beneath the surface, money flows, alliances shift, and influence spreads silently. Each new generation learns from the past, combining lessons in loyalty, betrayal, and strategy with modern tools and technologies. The rise of Britain's gangsters has proven one enduring truth. Power in the underworld is not about fame or visibility. It is about control, foresight, and the ability to remain unseen while orchestrating events from the shadows. The kings of the streets today are untouchable because they never reveal themselves. Their reign is quiet, invisible, and all-encompassing, A reminder that the underworld evolves faster than any law, any police operation, or any public perception can fully grasp. Britain's criminal empire continues, stronger and smarter than ever. A hidden force shaping the streets and the lives within them, without anyone realizing the true power that lies beneath.